Hi, and welcome to another episode of Ask on CYC. So the world around us is constantly changing. And for something that was rejected by people in the past is being embraced by society today. How do we deal as Christians? Today we're about to find out how the church deals with this today and what is their response on the topic of same-sex attraction. So please, if you have any questions, don't be shy and send us your questions to 0410 950 949. Remember, when you ask, you'll know the answer. And with today's topic, you can ask whatever you want and you will remain anonymous. So please send us your questions or give us a call and speak to our guest on tonight's show. So I'd like to introduce you to our guest. We have with us Father Paul Fanous.
Thank you, Mina.
Welcome, Father.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
It's a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
So today's topic is about same-sex attraction. So I want to cover it in a way that it's not normally covered at youth meetings or in other talks at church groups. I want to cover it in the attraction part. So there's a lot of misconception going around whether the attraction itself is a sin, besides even moving on to the act itself. So today we want to talk more on that aspect.
Yeah, good.
So I'll start off with my first question. So it's defined as a sexual desire. So can love or emotional stability be established from same-sex attraction?
So I think you're looking at it from an attraction perspective is probably the best way to look at it, because from the church's perspective, the idea of same-sex attraction is actually, we added a word to that, same-sex attraction disorder. Because we look at it as a disorder of sexuality or a disorder of attraction. So humanity is designed to attract to certain things or to desire certain things or to love certain things. And that can be disordered by the human mind, by the way we're brought up, by certain factors that come to play in our lives. And then from that desire then comes the act. Okay, but I think looking at the desire is a good first step. So your question, can love or emotional stability be established from a same-sex attraction? There is a lot of long-term relationships amongst same-sex attracted couples these days, both male and female. It's becoming more and more common, as you know. The media will try to tell us that it's more common than it is. Statistically speaking, it's still in America, for example, it's still around 4 or 5% of society. In Australia is a similar statistic. Sometimes when you watch TV and the way they discuss it, it looks as though it's a much, much higher percentage of people. In terms of longevity of these relationships, do these relationships really last a long time? Are they genuine love that lasts a very long time? It's hard to tell because they haven't been out in the open for a very long time. Statistically speaking, marriage in general, there's about 50% divorce rate in marriage in general between a male and a female. So, does this statistic then move on to homosexual relationships? Almost certainly, generally speaking, they're much shorter relationships. They have much more sexual partners. And that reflects that they don't find the same satisfaction in their relationships as a male and a female. They don't derive the satisfaction required for the longevity of the relationship. And that's why they have multiple sexual partners. On top of that, statistically speaking, they also, a homosexual person will have many, many more sexual partners below the age of 35, for example, up to the hundreds to 500 partners, for example, because they're not finding that you find between a male and a female, because the compatibility is just not there. It's not how they're designed in the first place. That's why we call it a disorder. So, generally speaking, the same level of love and attraction and stability that you get from a male and a female interaction, you will not get from male-male, female-female interaction or relationship.
Sure. I know in my introduction, I said that the world is changing and it's become more acceptable today. Even though homosexuality is more than 4,000 years old, there are still a lot of countries in the world that are not accepting towards it, whereas there are some countries where people actually get stoned and jailed for this behaviour. Why is that?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, a couple of countries, for example, like Uganda, for example, is completely anti-homosexuality. It's illegal still in Uganda. Some of the Islamic nations, again, the capital punishment for offences, for that kind of offence. Normally, those countries are more traditional in their mindset. They're not secular, they're very religious. And so normally they will then still hold on to values of the past. Western society or secular society has moved completely in an opposite direction. In fact, you can see that Western society or secular society has not only accepted it, but embraced it, loves it, and in fact is propagating it. As you see with those programs that they put in schools these days, these anti-bullying and safe schools programs, which are designed specifically about sexuality, not about just bullying. And it's being forced on schools all over the world. Canada, America, Australia are forcing them on schools to the point where some schools in other countries, they're being forced to implement programs, like Catholic schools, for example, are being forced to implement the programs at the threat of being closed down or their funding taken away. And so in the church, for example, in the secular countries like Australia, America, Canada, we follow society in general's attempt to integrate with the homosexual or the same-sex attracted groups. All these other countries, for example, and historically, homosexuality and the act of homosexuality has been categorically rejected, ostracized, persecuted, which is wrong in itself. And part of the response to that is now this push in the opposite direction. Once they get a little bit of acceptance, then the opposite will become true, and they'll become not only accepted but favoured. So the church with society comes to the conclusion that yes, maybe in the past things have been done wrong. The categorical rejection, ostracization, the feeling of inadequacy that the church and society, not just the church, I mean society will tell us it was only the church, but society and the church have rejected them. Now the church agrees that yes, we need to make more effort in that direction. Of course, that attitude is wrong, but we then part away from society in that it's a correct way of life. It is not a correct way of life. It's a disordered way of life. It's a disorder of sexuality that the church then says, how do we fix this? How do we help someone who's struggling with this problem, this emotional disorder? Because it is an emotional disorder. It's not even a sexual disorder. It's an emotional disorder, a desire for love of the same sex. How do we fulfill this? One symptom of it is then the attraction to males or attraction to females for a female. That's a symptom for a small portion of people. Other symptoms could be anger, for example, from that same emotional disorder. Can be self-esteem issues, body image issues, etc., etc. They're all symptoms of an emotional disorder.
Okay. I have a little confession to make. So before coming on the show today, the next question that I'm about to ask you, me and my mum had a little debate on it. And it's not just me and my mum. I've realised this is a question that's been debatable amongst the youth today. So the next question I'm about to ask you is probably the $1 million question. Are they born with it?
Are they born that way? That is a $1 million question. Everyone keeps talking about this, the gay gene, they call it. At this point in time, science has not discovered anything to do with the gay gene at all. In fact, they've done some twin studies, and they've found that if a twin is same-sex attracted or homosexual, the chance of their twin having the same condition or disorder or attraction is only 50%. So we discovered that there is no gene for this. It has never been discovered, in spite of what anyone says. Medically, it has never, ever, and scientifically, it has never been discovered. And to be honest, it doesn't exist. Are they born that way? It is a complicated question. People are born differently. Some with sensitive temperaments, some with very tough temperaments, some with angry temperaments, and different types of temperament. And then we are thrust as human beings into the world hopefully in a family, but sometimes not in a family, unfortunately. And then we grow up in an environment. And some of us might suffer trauma. Some of us have very stable, loving families. Some of us have very stable, loving families, but there's a deficit there somehow. And then that has impact on us as we grow up. So as we grow up, our temperament then dictates how we react to certain situations and then how people react to us. So one of the main ways that that people have discovered, generally speaking, that homosexuality develops in a person is, for example, in a male child who equate with his father very well, doesn't get along with his father, they don't understand each other very well. Rough games, rough tumble games, the boy doesn't like. He prefers to play with his mum and with his female siblings. The dad doesn't get along with the child, so then there's a disconnection between the father and the son, and they just don't understand one another. That disconnection can also come from an absent father, an angry father, a drunken father, any kind of disconnection with father and son. So then the boy then grows up not understanding or not equating or loving his father or knowing what it means to be a man. And so he then searches out through life that love connection with a man, that one that would naturally should have come from his father. And so he starts to associate better with the females, with the opposite sex. And as he grows older, he becomes more comfortable hanging out with them. And over time, what happens is that his same sex becomes other to him, becomes something different, becomes exotic. And then as you get older, that attraction then starts to grow in a person, that this exotic thing, I start to become attracted to it. And then it becomes a part of their life. And that's a typical example for a male child. The similar thing with the female child, with that disconnection with her mother, or not being able to associate with her female kind because of her temperament, which might be she enjoys rough games, she loves games, that kind of thing, therefore hanging out with males. And then as they grow, the environment then has a major impact on them. And then they can develop this same-sex attraction.
Okay. So what is being lacked at home is what is being sought after when they leave the home.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what happens.
So the home environment is very important.
It's critical.
Okay.
The home environment is critical to everything. It's not just same-sex attraction. That it's critical to anger. It's critical to envy. It's critical to my self-esteem, my self-image, my connection with other human beings. It all comes from a stable home environment that I then understand myself and then reflect that onto God. If I trust my parents, I can trust God. That's what happens in the home. And unfortunately, these days where it's so easy for relationships to break down, where a child can grow up with just a mother or just a father or a stepfather or stepmother so easily, unfortunately, that child doesn't get that same stability that's required all his life, from all that tension that's happening at home.
Sure. So going back on the whole born with it topic, a lot of the arguments people have is that some males are born with more estrogen than they have testosterone. So I looked into that and I read up on that, and there's a lot of backlash about it, saying, so how do you explain the big muscle-bound bodybuilding homosexual? If the case is they have high estrogen, then they don't have the ability to gain such muscle mass. So
what's my perspective on that? Yeah.
So technically, the whole imbalance of hormones is not the issue.
Doesn't work. No, I don't think it is that. I don't think it is that at all. I think the only neurochemical imbalances are ones that are associated with mental health disorders, like serotonin, dopamines, noradrenalines, those kind of things that happen in the brain, which come from mental health. So depression, anxiety, all these things, they can come from a similar problem that caused the same-sex attraction in the first place. That's why they're so closely associated with mental health problems. In terms of the estrogen and testosterone, not necessarily. You can have a boy who has a huge amount of testosterone in his body and still have a very sensitive temperament. It's got nothing to do with his temperament. And that temperament is then what may predispose to same-sex attraction.
Okay. So let's talk about control. Do they have control over it?
Good question. I was reading a book. I have a little boy. He's almost 4 years old. So of course I read these books on bringing up boys, just to learn how to deal with this. And he was a guy called Dr. James Dobson wrote this book, and he had a chapter on homosexuality, and he addressed this question: do they have control over it? Exactly. And he said, frankly, no. Frankly, no. The majority who suffer from same-sex attraction do not. And if you think about it logically, would anyone choose, at least in his time past, now these days it's a little bit different, but in time past, would anyone choose to act in a way or to desire things that he knows he'll be alienated by society, he'll be alienated by his family, he'll be disowned, he'll be alienated by his church? No one will choose these things. It's something that, in fact, people often in the past used to fight against very strongly. So the majority do not have control over the desire itself. The desire itself, they don't have control over. It's, as we said before, they're normally a victim of the way they've grown up, or even sexual abuse, for example. So they're a victim in some way, normally growing up, and then they find themselves with the desire that they normally don't want, or at least historically they did not want, which they're not sure. But what they do have control over is the act. They may not have control over the desire, but they do have control over the act. Just like anyone who feels anger brewing in himself. He has the control to be able to stop violence. Exactly the same way. We have many desires in life. Even in marriage, someone might desire someone outside their marriage, but they don't then justify the action to follow up with that. So I don't think that the majority of same-sex attracted people have control over the desire itself, at least initially, but they do have control over the action. They don't have to take the next step.
And that's when it becomes wrong.
That's when it becomes a sin. That's when it becomes wrong. That's when it becomes a mistake.
Okay. So someone can live a celibate Christian life and have the same sex attraction?
Certainly they can. Okay. Certainly they can. In fact, many saints have had that problem. And one Russian father, I think it was Father Seraphim Rose, had this problem and was very candid about his previous life. And part of his journey to Christ was to trample on that, to say, no, I will not act in this way anymore. This is something that is disordered, is not the correct way that sexuality should manifest in humanity, and is not my path to God. This is destroying my path to God. And so he trampled on it. And in fact, it's a very holy path for someone to either live celibate or seek treatment and resolve the emotional disorder. Because just like any emotional disorder, it's very treatable. It's very treatable.
Sure. Okay, so my next question could also relate to them being born with it. This is so I'm going to ask this question very specifically because this question has been passed around also on the topic amongst the youth. And the question is, can a 4-year-old determine that they are homosexual or have same-sex attraction? So the reason why I want to ask this question, because it could relate back to whether they're born with it or not. Yeah,
it is an interesting question. And some emotional problems can manifest in very small children, one way or another. In terms of sexual attraction, 4-year-olds do not manifest sexual attraction. So they can be confused about their identity, but they're still developing their gender identity at that stage. They haven't yet developed their gender. When now, these days, a little 4-year-old boy says, I want to be a girl, society says, no, you should be a girl. You're right, you have the right to be a girl, and they dress them as a girl, confusing the child even more. Whereas a 4-year-old who doesn't have yet understand his gender, if he says, am I a girl or a boy? His father says to him, you're a boy. That's a matter of fact. It's a matter of fact. So they instill that what they are very early on. And it's not propaganda, it's not brainwashing or sabotaging their gender identity. No, it's not at all. It's simply teaching them what they are. It's like a little boy coming to his father and saying, am I bad? No, you're a good boy. You might sometimes have bad behavior, but you're a good boy. If I tell my child he's always bad, what's going to happen to him? He'll have defiant disorders, he'll have all sorts of antisocial behaviors as he grows older. So unfortunately, we're confusing our children these days by so quickly accepting a child who says, I want to be a girl today at school. A boy who says that, or a little girl who says, I want to be a boy today. No, you're a girl. It's very normal for children to dress up in the opposite sex. It's very normal. Just because someone does that, or a little boy tries on some makeup, or a little girl plays soccer, that doesn't mean that she's a boy, or she wants to cut her hair. Unfortunately, society forces this on the kid from a very young age, confusing identities, because they're not taught what it is. And these days as well, as though we're brainwashing our kids. Are we brainwashing my kid to say lying is bad? Of course I'm not brainwashing my kid. I know that it's bad for him in the future if he continues to lie. What's wrong in teaching our children something? Or telling our children that they're human beings, they're not something else? And nothing wrong in teaching them the reality of life.
Okay. We're going to go for a quick break and we'll come back and continue our discussion. So thank you to our audience members who have been tuning in. Please send us your questions or give us a call and speak to Father Paul Fanous on the live show tonight. The phone number is 0410 950 949. Please don't be shy. Send us your questions. You'll never know the answer if you don't ask. Thank you.
CYC, Christian Youth Channel.
Welcome back to Ask on CYC, where we're talking about the topic of same-sex attraction. So continue our discussion, Father. I want to let's bring some biblical sense into today's topic. So I want to talk about Jesus and why he specifically did not talk about the sin of homosexuality.
Interesting question. Yeah, he didn't specifically mention. Of course, St. Paul did. He mentioned it very specifically. Old Testament mentions it very specifically. But Jesus himself did not mention it specifically. But that doesn't mean he didn't disagree with homosexuality or same-sex attraction or himself perceived that it was a problem. Jesus was silent on a lot of sins. Jesus was silent on a lot of, for example, drugs. He never mentioned drugs, drug taking. He never mentioned smoking. It didn't exist at the time. He didn't mention pedophilia, for example, or another disorder. He didn't mention lots of things. Jesus couldn't mention every single sin or every single decision humanity has to make in life. Jesus gives principles. He gives himself, he gives a way of life. So, for example, on the Sermon on the Mount, which is core to a lot of Jesus' teachings and his explanation of the Old Testament and the laws of the Old Testament, how in the New Testament we are to apply them and understand them. He covers a lot of topics, for example, anger and judging. And one of the things he covers is sexuality in general. And Jesus is very clear on sexuality. And he says there is no pure sexuality outside of marriage. Humans are sexual beings. And he knows that there's a gift there for humanity, that we desire certain things and we have certain needs as humans. And he gives us a clear path to marriage. And he says in marriage, between a male and a female, there is a pure sexual relationship. Anything outside of that is disordered or wrong. For example, pornography is another thing that Jesus does not mention, although, he does talk about lusting after other people. But pornography is a sexual relationship, in a sense, outside of my marriage. Therefore, Jesus makes no provision for it. Any sexuality before marriage, for example. Again, something else that the church has consistently said is wrong because it's not provided by Christ. It's not provided. He makes provision for sexuality within marriage, understanding full well that is the only pure way of humanity maintaining their sexuality and maintaining families. We cannot maintain families, which is, as I said before, is the stability of humanity. Individual human minds and all of humanity is through family. So without marriage and without having sexuality just in marriage, then there's no stability in humanity. And God knows that. And he knows that humans will suffer badly if they start to go outside of that. And of course, if you think about same-sex attraction in general, they don't have the capacity naturally to have children. Which is really sad reality for someone that chooses that pathway, that they miss out on that gift that is to humanity of family life and having a child and that love and that growing and that journey to heaven together as a family, which you cannot have naturally in a same-sex attracted couple.
Okay, I've just got a question that just came in from the audience. They're asking, many Copts who have this type of attraction fear the church and its ideals. How can one live within the Coptic community without feeling isolated? It's actually a good question.
It's a very good question. It is a very good question. And it touches on what we talked about before, the categorical rejection and ostracization and persecution almost of people who identify themselves as same-sex attracted. And unfortunately, of course, within the Coptic Church, there is still a big, strong negative push against that. Partly because we acknowledge that it's wrong. As a church, we have to accept that it's wrong. It is a disorder. Someone who is suffering from this, the only way they can ever improve themselves is if they do acknowledge that there's a disorder there. Of course, there's many people in our community suffering from this. Many of them silently. Many of them silently because of the shame and associated with it and the fear associated with it from their family, from the church, from their Sunday school teachers, from the priests. I encourage anyone who's suffering in that way to go and speak to their confession father, because the church is now coming to understand things a little bit better. Not to, as society, we divorce from society in that we accept any action and we take everything that anyone does as correct. No, we don't say that as a church. What the church says is that, yes, this person's suffering and they're a victim. Come to a priest, speak to the priest, see what the priest has to say. You'll be surprised at the acceptance, you'll be surprised at the love, and you'll be surprised at the support that the priest can give you and the experience that some of the priests have at managing this, at helping this emotional disorder. Just like any other emotional disorder. Just like when we're sad, we don't know how to make a decision, we go to the priest for support. In the exact same way, we go to the priest for support. In the exact same way, when we're guilty, when we've committed a sin like we've watched pornography or masturbation or we've lied to someone, we go to the priest, 1, for absolution, 2, for advice. How do we get out of this? Should I see someone? Is there someone I can speak to? What can I do to help myself? So I encourage anyone who's suffering in this way to go and seek help in a positive way, not a negative way. Go and seek help. You'll be surprised at the acceptance as long as we don't try and force on the church our ideals. Unfortunately, society is forcing on the church their ideals. So it's like someone who says, I want to cheat on my wife and I want the church to accept me as I am. Well, unfortunately, the church will never. The church will never accept someone to cheat on their wife and say, I will continue cheating on my wife and be in the church. No, the church says no. You have a responsibility to your wife. You have a responsibility before God. Unless you're willing to be monogamous, then it's not acceptable way of life. It's not acceptable. To have same-sex attraction itself is not a sin. But to then take that into the act, and then to insist that the act is correct or fine or a very acceptable way of life is not correct. And the other thing is, just to give hope as well, is there is priests in the world that deal with this a lot. One priest, Abuna Botros in Egypt, he says he's dealt with many, many cases, and there is a lot of hope. A lot of hope that the disorder is very easily corrected. Maybe not quickly corrected, but easily corrected. Just with that love connection with God, love connection with a spiritual father, then these things are correctable. So don't lose hope. My point is, don't lose hope. Even if you have someone in your family, don't lose hope. As long as we approach things correctly, then there's hope. And with us, in Christianity, a very important Christian principle is that with Christ, everything is healable. Everything is resolvable. Everything is fixable, and everything is redeemable. So come to Christ with your problem, come to your confession father, and you'll be surprised at the at the positive reaction you'll get.
I think a lot of people have the misconception that this is the worst sin out of all sins, whereas they're failing to understand a sin is a sin.
A sin is a sin, exactly. A sin is a sin, and a disorder is a disorder. A victim is a victim, and they manifest in many different ways. This is an obvious one. This is one that has repulsed people for a long time, and therefore they reacted very negatively against it. And unfortunately today still you'll find people that react very negatively against it. Polar oppositely, in society you'll find people react over positive about it as well. I think either way is not correct. I think we need to find a proper way of addressing things, a proper way of helping people. People need help. People come to the church to be loved. People come to the church for acceptance. People come to the church to find Christ. Of course, you can't come on your own terms. You can't come saying that I'm going to live it however I like and I'm going to be accepted by the church. No, not at all. And Christ himself will not accept certain things. Christ doesn't accept hatred. He doesn't accept it. He's not able to live in the heart of someone who hates. He's not able to live in the heart of someone who envies. He's not able to live in the heart of someone who is sexually disordered and living a life completely selfishly sexually. No, he can't. He can't. But he is able to correct that in a person. He is able to correct that in a person.
Okay, we've got another question that just come in. They're asking if this disorder is controlled, can the person seek God and be considered for the calling of the priesthood if he is called?
Again, very interesting. It's like any other sin. Someone has same-sex attraction, they can be considered for anything in the church. Of course, priests in the Coptic Orthodox Church are generally married. Okay, there is celibate priesthood, and if that's just a sin that someone is dealing with repentance, with confession, and it is controlled and it's not acted upon, then it's between them and their bishop and their priest. Just like any other sin. There's no difference between that sin and any other sin that we fight against. Generally speaking, in the Coptic Church, priesthood generally is one, married priests, generally speaking, and two, it's a nomination process. It's not someone chooses to enter into the priesthood like in some other churches. I'm not saying other churches are wrong in doing that. For example, the Catholic Church does it as vocation and seminary studies and becomes priest. I'm not saying they're wrong, but that's not the way of the Coptic Church. The Coptic Church is by nomination and then acceptance by both the person and their partner or their wife. Celibate priesthood and monasticism is a very different entity. That is, and of course, many people suffer with many different sins that enter into these pathways. And that's between them and their confession father, their calling, and of course their bishop and nominations and things like that. But someone who doesn't act on these sins is just like anyone who desires to look at pornography and doesn't act on pornography. There's no difference.
Sure. Okay, so a lot of youth today have been getting into reading of the writings of the early church fathers. So I want to ask you, what does the early church fathers say on this topic?
Again, an interesting question. Generally speaking, again, the early church fathers, they reject the act. They reject the act. In fact, a lot of the fathers acknowledge that there is same-sex attraction within monks, because a lot of these writings come from desert fathers writing. They understand that there has been historically a desire between people, but of course, again, they categorically reject the act. They categorically reject it. But in the same way that they rejected a monk who chased after women, and they chased after any money, for example. They rejected all these things. Monks are very strict in that sense. So the church has always rejected homosexuality as an act, as a way of life, has always rejected it, forever. The early church didn't really comment on same-sex attraction because generally, again, in history, they would only ever know someone was same-sex attracted if they were then partaking in the act. Now that we have a bit more understanding about it, we can help people who have same-sex attraction who then withhold themselves from the act, just like all of us with our sins.
Okay. I want to go back to scripture, talking about through scripture. So in the Bible it says that homosexuality is unnatural. What does the scripture mean by the word unnatural?
So as we said before, that sexuality is part of our nature. The desire for sexuality is part of our nature. It's something that grows in us as we grow older and develop our sexual identity, and as our hormones start to build, as our minds build, as our desires in life build. It's normal. And if someone has grown up in a stable environment, in a holy environment, in a loving environment, they will naturally then desire certain things. They will desire the love of other human beings. They will desire the love of a male will desire the love of a female. A female will desire the love of a male. Specifically one person, they will desire that. They will also desire the love of a mother and a father. They will desire friendships. We will desire all these things. Sexually, we will desire a relationship with someone. We will naturally desire that. If everything works as it's supposed to be, as it was designed by God, as it was designated by God, then we will naturally find ourselves attracted to females of our, as a male, females of our age, our peers, or within a similar age group, and that will be our natural desire. We'll have that from our teenage years, and we'll develop it all throughout lives. And that will be a normal part of our life. And then we'll hopefully find a partner, we'll get married, we'll have a very fulfilling sexual relationship, family life, and that's how things go. If something goes wrong along that path as we grow older, for example, sexual abuse, for example, is one example. The Royal Commission on Sexual Abuse, they found that some boys who were in boarding homes, for example, say an 11-year-old boy was sexually abused by a 14-year-old boy. When that 11-year-old the statistics tell us that they will then are more likely to abuse a 14-year-old boy, so that boy who molested them. Because something went wrong in their psyche because of that molestation. Are they a victim? Yes. Is it wrong? 100%. Are what they are at 25 desiring a 14-year-old boy, is that unnatural? 100%. That's not how they were designed. That's not how they would have grown up had something not gone wrong along the way. Exactly the same as a boy who's disconnected from his father, or a mother disconnected from her, a daughter disconnected from her mother. Something goes wrong with that desire. And so as you have things that are not naturally meant to be desired, like the same sex, or in pedophilia, for example, children, not meant to be desired. It's not how God has designed it. And even for a lot of the people that have suffered in this way, this disconnection, still only 5% of society, or 4 to 5%, will develop same-sex attraction. So still 95% of people will not. And so even if you have that disconnection, you still won't desire that, although some will. But it is an unnatural desire. So it's something that has become disordered, but is naturally good and ordered. And so that can be restored.
Okay. We actually got a caller in, so we're going to take the caller. So welcome, caller. Welcome to Ask. Please ask your question.
Hi, Abula.
Hi.
It's lovely to be able to speak to you on the show.
Thank you.
I have a question. It may seem a bit like a joke, but it's not a joke. It's actually very serious.
Yeah, sure.
And same-sex come and greet each other. Sometimes they may jokingly touch each other somewhat inappropriately. And my question is that wrong? Even if they're just joking, is it still wrong?
Okay.
Thank you, caller, for your question.
Thank you. Generally speaking, I mean, we don't like to talk in terms of right and wrong as so dogmatic about things. But I would discourage that kind of behavior for a number of reasons. One, as I said before, part of the problem we face as a church and as society in general is in the past that persecution or that making fun of homosexuals has then, when they've had a hold on society, has made them flip the opposite direction, has made all of society turn on Christianity in the face of homosexuality. A big part of what everyone hates about the church today is what they believe the church believes about homosexuality. So when we do things like that, inherently we're making fun, we're insulting homosexuality. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it's also belittling someone who might have this problem amongst your friends. So he might have an issue with this homosexuality and they see you joking and it's making light of their problem. In the same way that anyone who makes fun of someone who loses a family member, for example, or a general concept, if they're making fun of trauma that someone might go through, if someone in that vicinity is suffering with that, if we make fun, for example, or we make a joke about sexual molestation in children or anything like that, if we have someone in our family who's suffering in that way, then it's very insulting. It's very insulting. It's very belittling. It brings back memories. It hurts people. So there's a few reasons why we don't. The third thing is that generally speaking, when all our life we're making our jokes are sexually oriented, then if not same-sex attraction, we're still going to have problems with other sexual sins because our jokes are generally sexually oriented. It's not becoming of a Christian. And if anyone who's not Christian sees you do that, they certainly wouldn't really understand your stance in life. Are you a Christian? Are you not a Christian? Are you a son of God? Are you not a son of God? So generally speaking, I would discourage that kind of behavior because I don't think it's becoming of Christians. I think it can be insulting to people. And I think part of it is the problem that we're facing in general because of our humiliation and persecution and making fun of homosexuals in history.
Okay. We've got time for one more question. So this is a general question for the youth today. What is the Christian approach that youth need to take in order to show love and acceptance to the people who want to return to the church and who are suffering from same-sex disorder?
Okay, I think the first thing to say is that we have to be strong as a church and as a youth to say in the face of this growing propaganda in society that homosexuality is wrong, that it is a disorder, that there is something wrong, especially with society that's forcing it on the church, on people, on schools. We have to be strong in that sense. We cannot over-sympathize with the cause. That's the first thing to say. That we don't over-sympathize with the homosexual movement, with the safe schools programs and all these things. It's very important, because if we over-sympathize, then you'll find very quickly that we start to say that, no, it's a very acceptable way of life. And it is not. The church does not accept that it is an acceptable way of life. Then, accompanying that, with that strong, firm approach that the church does not accept, and that we as Christians are firm in our stance against it. Because you'll find you get persecuted outside all the time. It's taken for granted that everyone accepts homosexuality, and that we cannot talk about it negatively, that if you try and bring it up in your workplace, in your study place, you'll be persecuted. You'll be persecuted for having the opinion that, no, it's not a reasonable way of life. This is a disorder. Mind you, all this talk about disorder, it was, medically speaking, a disorder until 1973. And it was removed from the psychological manuals as a disorder. And soon it will be illegal for me to say that it's a disorder. I think in some countries already it's becoming illegal for me to say that it's a disorder. But we stand firm. As a church, we stand firm. No, this is a problem. This is a problem. It's an emotional problem in someone's mind. That's the first thing. Then if we have someone who's suffering with this, then someone close to us, someone around us, before that, we be firm, but we make clear to people that we love everybody. We understand that some people are suffering, that some people have this problem, and that we love them anyway. We love them and we're willing to help them in any way we can. That's in our workplaces, in our schools, in our universities, in every sense. We can show people that we love them by the way of living, our general demeanour. We don't insult, we don't make fun. We're not aggressive in the way we talk about things. We're balanced. We have a very balanced perspective, but we don't accept. We don't accept the way of life. And so we can show that in our workplaces. And so that if someone has this problem, then maybe they can confide in us, or they can talk to us, or they can and we can point them in the right direction. Then we accept them. We don't judge people. We accept them. We don't accept the homosexual way of life. We don't. We try to help them, push them in the direction of a confession father, or someone they can talk to, and work through these issues. I think as a church it would be wonderful if we had a specialized team or specific specialist in the area that could help us deal with it, who can help us, that we can refer to. Just like in medicine, when things are beyond us, we refer. We send to people in medicine. In law, they do the same thing. This lawyer is specialized, targeted at this, so we refer in that sense as well. So in spiritually, we can. It would be great if we had a team or individuals that we could send to who were specialists in the area, who were educated in the area, and were loving in the area. But again, we stand firm as a church. We stand firm. The church will always stand firm. I think the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, will always be firm against this push. And I think we have to. I think it's ordained by God, dictated by God, that we stand firm against the movement, but we're very accepting of individuals who acknowledge there's a problem and who would like to be helped. By all means, the church will help. The whole church has always been that way.
Very much for tonight's show. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a lovely show, lovely talk. I hope this helped, and I hope it was balanced.
Thank you for your insight. It was great. It was very uplifting. Thank you.
Thank you, man.
And thank you to our audience members who have tuned in tonight's show. Please, the show is called Ask. Unless you ask the questions, you'll never know the answer. Thank you. I'm Amin Ibrahim from your CYC studios in Sydney. Good night.
CYC, Christian Youth Channel.